I can't remember the last time I felt so conflicted about a book. Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Rachel Terry and I am the author of 2 young adult fantasy novels. If you're interested in learning more, information will be in the description box down below. Today's video will be about Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. If you look this book up on Goodreads, you'll see that it's almost universally loved with 5-star after 5-star after 5-star review. And for the first half of this book, I was pretty sure I was going to be one of those people. I loved this book and I thought it was basically a shoo-in for earning a spot on my shelf. And then the second half of the book changed that for me. So we're going to talk about what this book is about, what I thought of it, and why. The premise of this book is that after centuries of sleep, 2 gods have reawoken and are fighting again, and they are each recruiting humans to fight in their army as soldiers. The main characters, Iris and Roman, are directly affected by this, Iris more so because her brother Forrest enlists in Enva's army, Enva being the goddess who is fighting the god Dacra. And so Forrest goes off to war. In the very beginning of the book, we see Iris bid him farewell on the train station. Their mother is not there because she doesn't approve of Forrest's decision to enlist. Forrest tells Iris that he will write to her and he makes her promise to stay in school. Unfortunately, neither of those things happen. Forrest does not end up writing to Iris and she is forced to drop out of school and get a job because her mother has turned to alcoholism as a method of coping with Forrest being gone. The job that Iris gets to support her family is at a newspaper where she is directly competing with Roman for a columnist position. And at the beginning of the book, they are very much rivals. They don't like each other. Iris writes to her brother Forrest even though she hasn't received any letters from him. She puts her thoughts on the page and then she folds the letters up and sticks them in her wardrobe where they disappear. She doesn't know what's been happening to these letters, but one day she receives a letter back. Unbeknownst to her, her letters have been delivered into the hands of none other than her rival at the newspaper, Roman. Roman realizes pretty early on that it's Iris that he's talking to, but Iris has no idea that she's talking to him. And so the two of them forge a connection through the letters that they write to each other back and forth. I really loved the first half of this book. I appreciated how atmospheric it was and the world building. It felt very World War I-esque in terms of the technology and what's available and the way people dress, and just the vibes that it gave off were very reminiscent of what I know from World War I, what I've read in other World War I books, even though this is a fantasy. Usually I don't like this blending of historical type things and fantasy, but because this isn't actually historical fantasy, it's just fantasy inspired by real life events and themes, it somehow works. I really liked the atmosphere. The first half of this book was just beautiful. It made me cry, and I can't remember the last time, if ever, a book made me cry. If I feel anything toward a book, it's usually boredom or dislike, unfortunately. But this book really made me feel things, and there was a chapter where Roman wrote a letter to Iris and is talking about grief, something that neither character ends up being a stranger to, and it felt like at that point that the words were being spoken directly to me rather than Iris. I have unfortunately had experience with this in my own life, and the way that it was described in the book, you just knew that the author either most likely had experience with grief personally as well, or else understood it very well, because that's exactly what it feels like, and it was just beautifully done, and I really appreciated that. I also really enjoyed the effort and the work that was put into Roman and Iris's connection and their relationship. The author spent time developing genuine chemistry between the two characters, which is something that doesn't often happen in young adult books. So if you're not a fan of insta-love, this book doesn't do that. It does its due diligence and it does the work, puts in the effort, and it pays off. Not only do we want the two characters' relationship to succeed, we believe in it as well because we see the chemistry between them and we understand why they would have a connection to each other. We understand why the relationship would work. So all of that was to say that the first half of the book was definitely 5 stars for me, and I really did think that it was going to continue. And then the second half of the book happened, and it didn't work for me. So let me talk about why that is. I'm going to try to keep things general. I don't want spoilers in this video, but we'll see what happens. So basically, something happens in the latter half of the book where the two characters are taken to different locations and different circumstances. And you know at some point that Iris is going to find out that it's Roman that she's been writing these letters to, and that does happen. And Her reaction, I thought, was pretty much what you would expect. So then I was hoping that now you've got a change in the dynamic of their relationship. Before, they were communicating only via letter, and they were each falling for the other, only Iris didn't know the actual identity of the person she was writing to because she believed that she had never met him before. So it was kind of a weird sensation for her having feelings for this person that she'd never met, only come to find out she had met him, and she knows him fairly well, especially now through the things she's learned in his letters. So this was a new chapter and a new opportunity for their relationship. I thought this was going to be a chance for them to explore this new dynamic where they both acknowledge that they've each developed feelings for the other, and now we're here together in person. We should be able to expand this relationship and take it further because now we have a face-to-face connection and we can communicate in other ways besides just through letter. That didn't really happen. So minor spoilers here. What does happen is that once they've realized who the other is and they've admitted their feelings, Roman basically tells Iris that he wants to marry her, and she has to think about this decision, and she decides, yeah, let's get married. I know that in real life, during wartime, people often got married. They jumped into these things very quickly because they didn't know what was going to happen. They could both end up dead the next day, and that makes perfect sense. It was kind of a, we're not guaranteed tomorrow, but we can have tonight kind of thing. And while that did happen, and it makes sense, and I understand that, the way it was portrayed in the book just felt really jarring to me. We had spent all this time with this slow burn romance, building up the chemistry and the connection between the two characters, and all of a sudden, things escalated so quickly. It's like, yeah, it was me you've been running to all along. Let's get married. And then Iris agrees to it, and they do what married couples do. I get the feeling that the author doesn't want to have the characters engage in spicy scenes without them being married first, and the reason I think this is because it happened in A River Enchanted as well. And that's fair, I get that, but I don't understand why this scene is necessary in the book. It all felt way too fast given how slow the build-up for their relationship had been before and how wonderfully done it was and all of the work and effort that went into that. What proceeded after that in the second half just felt way too fast and jarring. And I really don't know, again, why this scene was included because I don't know who you're going to satisfy with it. It's not spicy, so you're not going to satisfy people who like really explicit steamy scenes because it's not that. The only thing I can think of is that there are some people who believe that this is the highest expression of love there is, and that a character's relationship is not complete or fulfilling somehow unless they engage in this kind of behavior, which is sad, I think, because that is not the ultimate expression of love, and just because you do that doesn't mean that your relationship is somehow better, but it is what it is. So that happened, and I was just disappointed given how slow the build-up had been and all the work that was put into it. It felt like it was just really rushed. The analogy that I used to describe it was, imagine you're at Thanksgiving or some other holiday with your family and you've just eaten a big meal and you're full. You know dessert is coming later and that your favorite dessert is waiting for you, but you don't want that right now. This felt like the book forced that dessert on you right now and made you eat it and shoved it down your throat, whether you were ready for it or not. It's your favorite dessert, but you weren't ready for it. And so because you weren't ready for it and you were still full from everything else, it really wasn't that enjoyable even though it was your favorite food. That's just what it felt like to me. Now apparently this is only going to be a duology like her previous 2 books were, so I get that you don't have a lot of time to develop chemistry, but it just felt like everything was moving way too fast. And because we've gotten to the ultimate goal, quote unquote, of a relationship in book 1, then there's nothing to read for in book 2 in terms of the relationship building. Spoilers for book 2. I don't like the way that the book ended. I think the epilogue was unnecessary and it would have been more impactful if the epilogue wasn't even in here at all. But the premise of book 2 is that one of the characters loses their memory and doesn't remember the other, and they start communicating via letter again and sort of have to reforge their connection from scratch. Or at least from how it was originally, where one character knew the identity of the other and one character did not. This seems repetitive to me. It seems like we're just falling back on the same thing that worked so well in the first place, but because we've already done it once, it won't work so well again. I don't know. Another thing that disappointed me is the plot of this book is that you have a literal war between 2 gods, and I didn't feel like it was ever fully capitalized on. You don't see much of the war itself, and you don't see anything of the 2 gods except at the end in the epilogue that I thought was unnecessary. It seems like a waste of potential to have a war between 2 gods and then not capitalize on that. And I think this is just something that fantasy romance falls victim to. The plot of the story is not the plot. The plot is a device used to bring the two characters together because that is the ultimate goal. Rather than starting out writing a book about a war between two gods and then realizing, hey, given the circumstances that these two characters go through together, it would make sense if they developed a connection, and then writing that in. The goal was the romance from the start. And so instead it was more like, I want these two characters to end up together. How can I do that? War between two gods. So the war, the plot, it's all just in there with the goal of bringing the two characters together. And I think that fantasy romance suffers for this. Like, that's why I just don't like it. I don't like when the romance is the whole plot. And I hesitate to even say that I don't like romance because, again, in the first half, I really did like the romance. I believed in it. So all of that to say, it just didn't really work for me. It felt like two separate storylines in a way in terms of how things were handled moving forward. We were in a specific place in part 1 and the characters were dealing with one thing, and then in part 2 we went somewhere completely different and they were dealing with different things. And I mean, that's kind of how stories go. Your characters have to change. They can't stay stagnant. They can't always stay in the same circumstances or location. But for me, it just didn't really work. It felt like things started to not be so good, in my opinion. I didn't like it as much when we changed and moved on to the second half. But that's just my opinion. I do still think that the book was decent. I can definitely understand why people like it, and I do appreciate that it wasn't insta-love, but I'm really starting to think that fantasy romance isn't for me. It seems like it's hard these days to find a fantasy book written by a female author that's not fantasy romance, and then on the other hand, it's hard to find fantasy books written by men that aren't all in on the world building to the detriment of the characters. We need both, and I think that fantasy romance goes too heavily on the characters. That's not to say that you shouldn't do that. I don't think they should back off from the characterization at all, but I do think that the world building should be fleshed out a little bit more, especially in this case with a war between two gods. This is this world that the characters are inhabiting, and it's going to affect them and the history and all that stuff, and yet nobody really seemed to know much about the gods that were fighting. There were myths, of course, but truth was harder to come by, and while history can be like that in our world, it just felt odd to me. So all in all, I feel really conflicted. I loved the first half very much. The second half just didn't do it for me. It felt like the romance just was rushed, and it was jarring considering how much time and effort went into building the relationship in the first place. I just wasn't ready to have it happen the way that it did. But lots of people like this book, and I'm happy for them, and I don't regret having read it, so that's more than I can say for a lot of books. So there you have it. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you. My name is Rachel Terry. I'm the author of 2 young adult fantasy books, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!